Unlike many of my peers, I never really jumped on the 300 bandwagon. I just couldn't really get into the whole testosterone oozing power fantasy that makes you want to work out for like 3 weeks before you give up. I just never really got into those sorts of stories because I usually just didn't like the main characters central to said stories. I mean, it's the same reason why I'm not really into games like God of War. That, and I was also kind of burned on the stylistic comic book movies thanks to films like The Spirit and Ang Lee's Hulk. It was just kind of a case of not interested because of the whole manliness factor, and just the fact that I was just sick of that particular style of movie by the time that it was really becoming popular amongst a lot of my friends. So I mention all this to just explain that I have not seen the previous 300 film, and I don't really have any plans to in the near future because, well, after watching this film, one, it feels like I don't really need to, and two, hasn't really sold me on it. Rise of an Empire is not so much a sequel to the previous film, but more or less a side story, as it has the prologue taking place before the events, but most of the film taking place during and after the events of 300, since it's basically focusing on the efforts of Athens to repel the Persian Empire instead of the Spartans this time around. So basically you're switching out the red capes for the blue capes. That's just the best way to look at it. With this film, you don't actually have to have seen the previous film in order to understand what's going on, because it does a good job of kind of getting you up to speed, while at the same time kind of trying to connect it as best as it can. Kind of hard since they couldn't get Gerard Butler back. So yeah, you don't need to have seen the previous film because it does a good job of getting you up to speed, as more of the focus of this film is on the efforts of Themistocles, as well as giving us a little backstories to both Xerxes and Artemisia. The film boasts the same comic book inspired style that was made popular in the previous film, complete with slow motion and CGI blood. However, unlike The Legend of Hercules, this film actually does it right, slowing down to the moments that actually warrant being in slow motion. I just mention this because Legend of Hercules did it so wrong, and it's actually kind of refreshing to see people do it right, even though this wasn't actually directed by Zack Snyder himself, because he was making Man of Steel at the time this film was being made, but I digress. Point being, it looks good and has a nice consistent style throughout its runtime, so if that's the kind of style you like, you won't be disappointed, especially since the people making this film had a better idea of knowing what they were doing. And while it does a good job of looking like a comic book, it kind of falls into the same problems that such an adaptation would fall under. The chief offenses being the over-reliance on voiceover, and the fact that some moments were really stretched out a lot longer than they needed to be. Now, while the visual effects don't exactly look real, the artificiality is kind of part of the style and it works to a point. I mean, with like the actual battle scenes with the fake blood and stuff, that one you can at least understand because that's part of the style. But then you get some moments where they're trying to do really minute details that you can still tell that they're doing CGI with the minute details, and it just wasn't really necessary. You could have gone by just as easily with just a little bit of like corn syrup and red food coloring instead of having to try to do a whole simulation blood effect for just literally a drop of blood from someone else's head. It was kind of the minor things that I'm just like, really? You dedicated time to create a visual effect for that when you could have just saved yourself effort? So there are times where the artificiality of the visual effects may get to some of the more keen-eyed viewers. Other than that, there's not really much else to say. I mean, I did enjoy the story, especially kind of the dynamic between Themistocles and Artemisia, since it's effectively a story about two tacticians trying to outwit each other. I was able to get into that, but really, it was mostly just eye candy. I mean, yeah, it had some nice story things going on to it, but much like Zack Snyder's other films, even though Zack Snyder wasn't the director, it still has kind of the same feel. It's a lot of flash, but not a lot of substance. So really it just comes down to whether or not you're a fan of Frank Miller's graphic novels or not, whether you're a fan of 300 or not, because really fans of 300 and fans of Frank Miller are probably going to enjoy the film a little bit more than I did. But even from what I've heard from some people who've seen the previous 300, they aren't really receiving it too warmly either. But for the most part, I enjoyed it, and at least was entertaining. That's pretty much most I can say about that. It may warrant viewing in theaters, given that one, it's in 2D, so you won't be breaking the bank, and two, if you're kind of going with the right group of people, you'll probably have a good time. And I may incur the ire of a lot of the other critics for this, but I'm going to give 300 Rise of an Empire a 4 out of 5. So that's it for this episode of Romney's Reviews. Tune in later today for my review of Mr. Peabody and Sherman. See ya then.